would you do if you were suddenly exposed to rabies? This is Joel Rothstein with Arlington Public News. And with us today is Officer Amanda Kennedy.
Hi.
So nice of you to come and join us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and I understand that you're going to help us about rabies right now, and it's a very timely event given that there was just something that happened. Can you tell us about that briefly?
Yeah, we had an incident last week where a dog got into an altercation with a raccoon. And in part, I think, because of the warmer weather, the raccoon was being a little more active, was out and about. And the dog is actually fine, but we ended up testing the raccoon for rabies because there was an exposure between the dog and the raccoon, and it did come back as a positive for rabies. In terms of that particular situation, the dog was up to date on its rabies vaccination, which is extremely important. I cannot stress enough how important being up to date is. And as a result, he is on a 45-day quarantine, but had it not been that, he would have been on a 6-month quarantine, or the Department of Public Health, from the Department of Agriculture point of view, may have suggested euthanasia. So certainly a good reason to make sure your pets are up to date on their rabies vaccine.
Absolutely. Okay, there are probably many of us who've heard the term rabies, but we really don't know what it is. Can you explain exactly what rabies is?
Sure. Well, rabies is a virus which is spread from saliva. So from a bite or saliva, typically, which come hand in hand, of course. And it actually operates pretty quickly. It attacks the central nervous system, and it moves its way up into the brain tissue. And at the point that it reaches the brain tissue is when, that's the point when the animal is going to be very close to death. It is 100% fatal. Any animal that does have it will die. There is nothing. There's no carriers that don't show signs and are fine. Having said that, animals that are positive with rabies can also appear fine. So there's a lot of myths out there around seeing animals in the day, and that's not unusual. Things like skunks and raccoons, which are the typical carriers of rabies in Massachusetts, they are not fully nocturnal. So oftentimes we'll get phone calls that there's a skunk or a raccoon out and it's the daytime and they're worried. And that's okay. That's actually not that abnormal. What is abnormal is if you see them behaving in what we would call a drunken manner, if they're circling, if they appear to be falling over. These are all things that have to do with that central nervous system again. And so if that's happening, then we're dealing with an animal that we know is sick at least. Rabies can look very similar to distemper, and we have a high rate of distemper in the raccoons here in Arlington as well. So it's not something that anybody can diagnose by looking at an animal. And that's why it's really important that we take very clear precautions around how we handle wildlife and what we do to protect ourselves and our pets.
Now, what about other animals like squirrels or mice or something like that? They're not typically carriers, but they could be bitten by a raccoon. Then will they be a carrier?
So there aren't any recorded cases of squirrels having rabies in Massachusetts, or rats or mice for that matter. It doesn't mean that they couldn't. What they call any fur-bearing animal, so essentially mammals, but any fur-bearing animal theoretically can contract rabies. And interestingly enough, there's different strains of rabies. So there's something called raccoon rabies, and then there's something called bat rabies. These are very technical terms, obviously. Those typically what we're seeing here in Massachusetts is raccoon rabies, which can infect dogs, cats, people, skunks. So these different strains aren't breed specific or species specific. What you'll see with what they'll say around squirrels and rats and mice is that it's possible. And if there was an incident where your dog or your cat or yourself was bit by a squirrel or any other kind of rodent, that's something that the Department of Agriculture's Animal Services Division actually takes on a case-by-case basis about how to address that, because there aren't any known cases and we're not real concerned. So the animals that we are concerned with are skunks and raccoons. And more recently, there have been a few cases of woodchucks coming up positive as well, and that's a newer development in this area.
Okay. Nobody wants to get rabies. what do you advise for avoiding the situation?
Sure. So there are resources available, which I believe you'll have access to at the end of this program. There's our best resource around issues with rabies is really issues with wildlife, and the best way to deal with that is prevention. People often want to figure out how to remove them, but in fact moving wildlife is illegal. Harming wildlife in any way is also illegal, and so it does put us as humans living in this urban area at a little bit of a disadvantage, because the precaution measures that we need to take sometimes feel frustrating, but they're worth it. So you want to make sure that the outside of your home is well maintained, that there aren't holes or little spots under a shingle that a critter could climb in. You want to make sure that your trash is well covered. Things like that. You don't want to feed pets outdoors. So if you have an indoor-outdoor cat, you really don't want to feed them outside. Or if you do, you want to feed them while you're present and then pick it up. So anything that you can do to deter them from being around your property. There are other methods that you can use as well. There's different natural methods, like you can buy coyote urine at the hardware store, or cayenne pepper. I know that both local hardware stores here carry it. And you can sprinkle those things around, which they don't like, and if it's inhospitable, they'll likely move on.
I see. Very interesting tip. Now, let's say your animal gets bit by one of these rabid animals, all right? Somebody's pet gets bit. But the pet doesn't speak our language very well, right?
No, they do not.
And if the owner didn't see that pet get bit, what signs are there that would alert the owner that there's a possible rabies situation on hand? Yeah,
so it's interesting because we don't ever see signs that are consistent with rabies. What the best thing that we do is sort of more of a preventative measure. So the situation you're talking about, let's say your dog was in the backyard and you weren't, and a couple days later you notice that he's limping. And this is sort of most typically how these things happen is, oh, you notice your cat or your dog is limping, or something's sore. You take a look, you bring him to the vet shaves the area, and lo and behold, there is a puncture wound from what looks like a bite.
Okay.
So in the animal welfare world, we call that a wound of unknown origin.
Okay.
So this is an animal that has gotten a bite or a scratch, and usually you can tell which it is, but the outcome doesn't change, whichever one it is. And if it's an unknown origin, then we have to proceed with the possibility that the animal that bit or scratched them had rabies. Now, there's no way for us to know, and there's no real cause for alarm with that, but you need to proceed appropriately. Each municipality in town has an animal inspector in addition to an animal control officer, and so I operate as our animal inspector, and I'm appointed by the state to do that. And that is the person that handles bite exposures and quarantines. And so anybody whose animal gets a bite, known or unknown from where, should be contacting me. And it's not a bad thing, and nobody's going to get a big red X on their file, and it doesn't mean your dog's bad or your cat's bad or that you're not a good pet owner. All it is a way for us to keep track of these things, and it gives me an opportunity to advise that resident as to the best course of action. If your animal's not up to date on its rabies vaccine, then the quarantine period is much longer. And additionally, if your animal's not up to date on its rabies vaccine and should be bitten by a rabid animal, then that's really serious.
Okay.
And you may lose your pet. In fact, you most likely will.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what about a human, let's say a child or even an adult?
Sure.
Has this confrontation with a rabid animal, and they don't know. They think, oh, it's nothing, How can you tell a human might be at risk now for getting rabies?
Well, so again, we have no way of knowing if an animal is rabid unless we test it. In order to test it, we actually need to, it either needs to be deceased or we need to humanely euthanize it.
Yeah.
And they test the brain tissue. So in animal or people situations, if you have an incident with an animal, it's important to call us right away. If we can get that animal for testing, that is the ideal way to handle that, because we'll have the results back in a couple of days and we'll know for sure. In terms of a person, if you get an exposure, if you get bit or scratched by any animal that at all, you should be calling animal control and I can help you figure out what's the next best step. There's not any major cause for alarm. While rabies is fatal, we also have really good treatment available. Once you actually start showing signs of rabies, that's when there's a problem. And so you have a 10-day window as a person. If you are exposed, you have a 10-day window where you would have to start what's called post-exposure vaccines, which would be a series of shots. Those are the ones that everybody gets really worried about because they used to be in the stomach, but they're not in the stomach anymore. They're really not that bad. In fact, they're a gorgeous bright purple color, and they do a series of shots on a very specific schedule. And that, if you had been exposed to rabies, we've seen that to be I think 100% effective in this country.
Very nice.
So, for instance, in Massachusetts, we had a case of a person with rabies in 2011. It's believed that that person actually contracted that in Nigeria through a bat. And then I think before that, it was 1983. There was another case of rabies in Massachusetts. So those are pretty low numbers if you think about our population. So getting those post-exposure vaccines is really important. At that point, if there's an exposure and we don't know if the animal has rabies or if it comes back as positive for rabies, then I'm involved from the animal perspective, but the Department of Public Health is also involved to make sure that you're getting everything that you need through your doctor.
Okay. Now, if the person didn't get the shots in time, what are these symptoms?
I'm not certain I'm qualified to answer that.
Okay.
That might be something that's better asked of the CDC, the Center of Disease.
Okay.
I can tell you what I think, but the reality is that you're not going to wait those 10 days. Nobody should ever do that. What they talk about in sort of more general terms is that sometimes people will have flu-like symptoms. Or itchiness at the site. And this is information that I've gotten from World Health Organization. And the only reason they have that information, of course, is because in other parts of the world, there's quite a few human rabies deaths because there's not the preventative care and not the follow-up that we have here in this country. And Massachusetts does an excellent job with rabies prevention.
Okay, well, that's very good to hear. And I guess because we do such a great job, our numbers are very low.
Our numbers are extremely low. And sometimes people are frustrated by the rules that we have to follow when there is a bite, and they feel that it's too extreme. And one could argue that perhaps it is too extreme, but there's a reason that those rules are there, and what it's done is made us really safe. I think the only other thing I would mention about that too is we did have this one raccoon come back as rabies positive, but I can assure you that I do not think that means that there's an increase of rabies in Arlington. It simply means that we've tested an animal that had it. We already know that it's present, and it is mostly present in skunks and raccoons. And it's important that people remember and take opportunities like this to be reminded, to make sure their animals are up to date, to make sure they're taking good preventative measures, and also to educate our children about good relationships with wildlife, which is really, you should look at it, but don't touch it, don't approach it, tell an adult, things like that, because it's not just rabies that we have to worry about. There are other zoonotic diseases that animals carry that could be problematic for us.
Okay. You mentioned about having to check the animal that did the biting.
Sure.
Which means you have to catch or arrest the animal, right? So how do you do that? What's the process in trying to catch this animal? Do you have to read the animal its rights too?
Well, so far the chief has not told me that I have to read their rights. I don't know if they have a constitution just yet. No, I have a lot of equipment that helps me. I also have a lot of experience with animal handling of both domestic and wild animals. So I have different tools, different size nets, and something called a control pole, which is a very long metal pole with a noose at the end. And it's humane and it doesn't hurt them, but you can kind of pull it and tighten it. And typically with a raccoon or a skunk, if I needed to use my control pole, I would noose them up under one arm and around their neck so as not to choke them. And close it that way, and it's a great way to lift them. I had a raccoon a couple of months ago that was stuck in a dumpster. He was perfectly fine. He seemed very healthy, but he could not get back out. And I had to do that, and I realized that maybe I need to go back to the gym, because he must have been about 45 pounds, and trying to get 45 pounds at the end of a 4-foot pole up out of a dumpster proved to be more difficult than I thought.
Maybe take up the sport of fishing, and you'll have that same type of movement. Yeah. What's been your most interesting adventure in being an animal control officer?
Well, I have a lot of interesting adventures, I suppose. I was involved in a case where there was a crocodile in the Charles River. That obviously wasn't when I was here in Arlington, but working with another organization. I have a great respect for wildlife, and I really enjoy being able to help raptors. And we've had a number of red-tailed hawks here in Arlington that have become injured. And we don't know exactly how, with broken wings. Most likely that's them flying across a road and they get clipped by a car. And I've had great success in catching them and bringing them to either Tufts Wildlife Clinic, which is actually in Grafton. I wish it was in Medford, it'd be a lot easier. Or New England Wildlife Center, which is in Weymouth. And they're capable of doing the rehabilitation needed. And I'm hoping this spring, if those hawks that we brought do well, we'll be releasing them back out in the areas that they were caught. And I think that'll be really exciting too.
How does somebody get a hold of you? They have an animal issue. They want, they've heard you on the air right now. You've sold them that you're the person to solve it.
You betcha.
How do they get a hold of you?
So if it's an urgent thing, if you have an animal in front of you that is, injured, or this is some sort of an emergency or urgent thing that you need response right away, then please do call the police department's dispatch office. You can call 781-643-1212. You can also call my office. As I'm often out in the field with my net, I don't sit in my office, and so if you do call my office, you'll likely need to leave a message. But if it's not urgent, then I encourage you to do that. And that number is 781-316-3950. And you can also email me. Email's great, and that's akennedy@town.arlington.ma.us.
I guess we have your number now.
You do, and I hope you call, because I really am here to help.
Very good. Officer Kennedy, thank you so much. The information you gave us on helping us understand what rabies is, how to combat it, how to avoid it, invaluable. Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I'm Joel Rothstein, Arlington Public News.